I want to go over some of the basics of both armor and props as well as fabric. This is sort of like a one-on-one, or not one-on-one, 101 kind of class. So we're going to start by talking about materials. So specifically for armor and props, there's a wide variety of things that you can use. My personal favorite is EVA foam. This is like a slightly squishy foam. If you've ever stood on anti-fatigue mats, like you have at like Harbor Stores, I'm not talking right. Harbor Freight anti-fatigue mats, or like in a kitchen, it's that.
And craft foam.
Yep.
Like the stuff you would have used when you were kids.
Yep. If you look over to the Bellows cosplay that we have over there, the gauntlet there is made out of EVA foam. EVA foam is great because it comes in a lot of different thicknesses. You can get it like very thick, like probably this thick, or as thin as 2 millimeters. So it's really nice to layer up. You can easily add some details, or you can have like a thick prop. Some other things that are out there are foam clay. So this is very similar to EVA foam after it dries. It's basically a clay material that you can sculpt. You can use it just like you would any other clay. And then after it dries, it acts like the EVA foam. So you can sand it down, you can glue it directly onto there, and it's essentially the same material, so it behaves the same, which is really nice if you're trying to like add some details on both your base and any details that you're adding in, just so that you're not working with like different hardnesses. Worbla is another big one. So thermoplastic is a whole category that we're going to talk about. Worbla is probably the most well-known. It comes in sheets like this. Do you want to go hand that around, let people touch it? So Worbla works by heat. Thermoplastic, sort of in the name. When you heat this up, it gets stretchy, and you're able to shape it however you want, and it also sticks to itself. So you don't have to use any sort of glue or anything, which is pretty nice. Fibra is another type of thermoplastic that is more smooth than Worbla in a lot of cases. We are going to go over the different types of Worbla a little bit later on. There's so many different types of thermoplastic nowadays, so it is kind of just like playing around and seeing what you like and what works for you. Plastomorph is another type of thermoplastic, but instead of sheets like that, it comes in little tiny pellets. So you melt it down and then you can sculpt it like that.
You just have to be careful if you're in super like humid or hot areas. It will lose form, because you can actually form most of them with like the heat in your hand sometimes. So just be very careful with that. And then insulation foam is another thing that you could use. Just like you get at Lowe's, Home Depot, it's really useful for large props, things like swords. I did an Asgore cosplay where I made the trident out of insulation foam. It's really useful to have it because it's lightweight, but it's thick already, so you don't have to do as much work. Like I was saying, EVA foam, you can get it about this thick. I wish I had a measurement, but like about this thick. And insulation foam, you can get it much thicker, and so you don't have to glue together multiple layers of EVA foam. It makes it a little bit easier. Expanding foam is another thing that you can use, the stuff that you get in the spray cans. This is very useful if you're doing more of like an organic shape, like say a Silent Hill nurse. It's perfect for that sort of mask because it already has that sort of like bumpy, organic, sort of like messy texture to it. It's also nice because you can carve away if it's like a very specific shape that you're trying to do, like some sort of scythe. Instead of getting a giant sheet of insulation foam, you could just like spray a half moon and then carve it down from there. Saves you some materials. And it comes in many different, weird to say this, sizes. Basically the particles of the expanding foam, you can get detail or larger, which is nice when filling things because it won't expand as much, or it'll expand a little bit. So keep an eye on the label if you buy that.
Yeah. So we will talk about how you work with all of these materials a little bit, but we're going to switch over to fabric now to talk about different types of fabric. So fabrics sort of come in two main categories. You have knits and you have wovens. So knits are pieced together like you see on the left-hand side of your screen. It's almost like if you've ever knitted anything, it's exactly that. Versus a woven where it's more of like an interlock, sort of like this. Wovens will not have much stretch to them, if any at all, whereas knits almost always will have a little bit of stretch. So I'm going to come around with some fabric samples. So this one here, I'm getting married this year, so I'm using all of my bridesmaid swatches, I'm sorry. This is a satin. This does not have very much stretch to it. It is a woven. This is a velvet, so this is a little bit of a weird one because it is stretchy. And
It's not always stretchy.
yeah, velvet usually isn't stretchy. This is just sort of an outlier. This one here, and it says on the little labels what it is if you don't remember. This is a chiffon, and this is a tulle. So this is one of those things where these are very similar. Chiffon is a little bit like finer. It feels a little bit nicer to touch, whereas tulle is a little bit more rough. If we wouldn't mind passing these around together just so you can tell the difference.
There's also bridal tulle, which is kind of in between, if you ever think of like a veil. So highly recommend, if you do not know the material, to go to a store and touch it, even if you don't have the colors you need. Just still touch it so you actually know what you're working with, and then you can order the color you want online.
So then we also have a couple more here. These are examples of knits. So with the knits, you have sort of, again, two categories. There's ones that stretch in one direction, which we call two-way stretch. So think of it like up and down or side to side. Then you also have four-way stretch, which goes both up and down and side to side. So if you're trying to make something like a bodysuit, for example, like a bunny suit, a four-way stretch is going to be more useful to get over your boobies. Whereas like a two-way stretch is useful for something like a gauntlet, where really you only want it to stretch in one direction.
T-shirts.
T-shirts too. They have a little bit.
T-shirts have mostly a two-way, but there's a little bit. Anything you don't want to kind of drag down on, or anything you don't want to really drag down on you, you don't want as a four-way, because it's just, it kind of becomes heavy and it's not good looking.
So this gray one here is an example of a two-way stretch, whereas this blue one is a four-way stretch. So feel free to play with it, feel it, see how it works. So the world of fabric is massive. There are way more than we're going to be able to cover in any amount of time. But basically every single fabric is going to fall into these two categories. Another category that I don't have on here that I do want to mention is natural versus synthetic. So synthetic is plastic. That's all that fabric is. Things like your polyester is probably the most common synthetic that you're going to see, versus cotton is probably your most common natural one. Again, Bellows is cotton, that's why I was looking over there. Silk is also another example of a natural one. It's basically like, does it come from nature or is it man-made?
And then there's also the latex on there around the
Yes,
edge.
so that's an example of a synthetic. With the synthetic ones, again, because it is plastic, it will melt, so you have to be a little bit careful with heat, especially when you're ironing or if you're doing any sort of like foam work on top of it. If you're hitting it with a heat gun, it can melt, so just be careful.
It is a lot harder to dye synthetics to match what you need. You would have to use a special dye, and even then, it's harder to hold on to the pigments. So keep that in mind if you need to make like something that's custom colored. Cotton is your, like 100% cotton is going to be your best bet to get the perfect color.
Alrighty, so speaking a little bit more about fabric. When we're looking at something on a screen, how do we tell what type of fabric it is? There's a few different things that are very important to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what a fabric is. One is the weight. So, I wish I had a better example of this. If you've ever seen somebody in like a very flowy dress, kind of like your Zelda dress, that is a lightweight fabric. So it has more movement to it, versus something like a velvet robe is going to be a heavyweight. It doesn't move as much. Like if there's a breeze and it goes flying, it's a lightweight. Whereas if it's very stiff, it's a heavyweight.
Yeah, some will actually say lightweight, medium weight, or heavyweight, but they might also say ounces. Like a 4-ounce would be a very flowy, an 11-ounce would be a heavier. So if you see that, that's what that means. And it's sometimes is very confusing, but that way you won't end up with canvas material when you're trying to buy something else. Yes. It took me a very long time to figure that out, even though I worked in the fabric industry. Yeah, I actually worked for fabric companies for a while, so I should have known, but I didn't.
So another thing that you should consider when you're trying to figure out what type of fabric you're looking at is the drape. So if you were to take, I gave out my examples. If you take your fabric and you pick it up like by pinching it, you can sort of see the way that it falls. If it's more stiff, that will help you identify what type of fabric it is. So like a cotton drapes very well, very easily. Something like an organza that has a little bit more stiffness to it isn't going to drape the same way. So if you're looking at like a dress on screen and you see how it's falling out, you can sort of figure out what you're looking at a little bit better. You're never going to be able to get it exactly unless you're looking at something very obvious like corduroy or velvet.
And there's also different cotton blends, which adds to weight. Like there's a linen cotton, which actually I believe is I believe that's what's shown in the picture is a linen cotton. Mm-hmm. And that actually is heavyweight, even though it's linen and cotton. But something about the way that they mix it, it makes it heavyweight. It's play with your fabric.
Yep.
Touch it. Go touch it. Go to all the fabric stores.
Yes. That's honestly the biggest tip when you're trying to find something for a cosplay. Just go and touch things. That's why Joann's is great. Joann's is kind of more expensive than a lot of the stores that you'll see online.
That's why I say go touch it and then buy it online.
Yeah, buy it online, but go touch things, experiment with them, see what seems to be right. So another thing with this picture that I want to talk about is grain of fabric. So fabric is directional. The easiest way to think of this, if you think of like a faux fur, there's definitely a direction to it, right? There's one way where it's right, and then the other way where it looks a little bit funky, it's falling kind of weirdly. Every fabric has that. It's just not always as obvious. So on this example here, this linen, the fibers are pretty big, so you can pretty easily tell where those little X's are, but every single fabric is going to have that. When you're working with patterns, they'll talk about working on the grain, they'll talk about working on the bias. Bias is going diagonal on those grains, whereas you got length grain versus cross grain, which are the two different directions. I'm
trying to remember how you can figure that out without, usually if you see the selvage is the edge that has like either the printing, usually you can tell with the direction. Cotton fabric, if you pull it and it has stretch, that's the bias. That's not, if you pull it and it doesn't have stretch, that's, the weave, but you can actually make cotton stretch by pulling it diagonally. It's how quilts with curved edges are done and stuff. So that's kind of another way where you can figure it out. Sometimes you want that bias, especially going around like your shoulders and things. You want that. So keep an eye on where your weave is. Keep your stuff directional, especially when cutting out those pieces on this stuff, because anything with a sheen, you're gonna notice the difference if you don't keep with the weave. Mm-hmm. We learned that a hard way with one of our members.
Yeah, we've made many mistakes, and that's how we know what to do now. So something else to keep in mind, you have to use different stitches on different types of fabrics. If your fabric is a stretch, so a knit, you always want to use some sort of a stitch that will have some give. A zigzag stitch is really good if you have a regular sewing machine. If you have a serger, that's even better. It'll allow the fabric to still stretch without just breaking your threads.
Yeah, and there's also, with a serger, there's different threads. There's a nylon thread that actually has a stretch to it. So if you need even more for like bathing suits, that has that. There's a lightning bolt stitch on most sewing machines now, especially even the most basic ones. The lightning bolt allows there still to be a stitch, but it still moves. So again, play. Just keep playing with everything and get comfortable and do all the different tests.
Would you be able to talk to interfacing while I show off the...
Yeah, can I see what you have in your slides though? Okay, interfacing. This is a big one for costuming because there are so many options. There are several major brands, but interfacing, how do I explain? So the fabric, if it's too thin but you still want to use it and you want to give it some form, you can go with a lightweight interfacing, which you would basically either iron on or sew into something, which kind of gives it a little more form. You can give it a lot of form. You can even get foam interfacing. So this is another one of those things where you go to the store and you feel all of the interfacing. There's an entire section at Joann's. There's fusible on one side. There's fusible on two sides. There's, like I said, the sew-in. There's also interfacing that is actually clear vinyl that you can turn any cotton fabric into basically latex fabric. So if you like something and it looks really cool, it's an actual iron-on vinyl interfacing. But I guess it would be an outer facing because this is going on the outer side, but they consider it interfacing. All your purses, all your backpacks, anything with embroidery, it all has interfacing just to kind of give the fabric more of a chance of surviving also. It gives it more strength. It adds to it. So do not skimp on the interfacing ever. Yeah.
It's very important if you're trying to like defy gravity like a vampire collar, you're gonna need a ton of interfacing.
Yes. I believe I did. Oh yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. I was gonna say I remember using a bunch on.
Yeah. So that capelet does sort of defy gravity a little bit, and it's because of the interfacing that's in not the hood but the the capelet part.
So that interfacing is actually called SF101. It is woven. It's a tightly woven fabric with one-sided fusible. So it still has give. A lot of purses use it, but I use it for stuff like this so that it would kind of stick out from the shoulders when he wore it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's up?
Yes.
So the question was, do you do the interfacing before you do embroidery? And
Yes. So with embroidery especially, you have, again, many options. There's tearaway, where you can do the embroidery, and what that does is it keeps the fabric nice and flat while you're doing your embroidery, and then you can actually rip it out. There's a sticky that it can stick to the back, so you don't even have to iron it on, and then it can also rip off again afterwards. There's iron-on that you would keep in there permanently. There's heavyweight. There's also puffy. Puffy's really cool. You can actually put the puffy behind it, and while you're embroidering, anything that's embroidered will kind of stand out more from the fabric. So this is interfacing, and especially embroidery is something that I could go on for like 2 hours. Kind of a background, I am a content creator for Janome sewing machines, and I specialize in embroidery. So if you ever want to talk about this, I will be at the Makersmith's booth afterwards to chat about it.
10 to 6 all weekend. We already spoke about grain lines. So now we're going to test you guys a little bit. We're going to talk about material selection. I picked out some characters that I think are pretty recognizable, and we're going to go over what you think you would use. So we're going to start off with Jon Snow. With this outfit, what do you think you would use for the different pieces? Go for it. Yeah, definitely. So his overcoat absolutely is fake leather. There's a few other things that I would use personally. Yeah. So I would use EVA foam for that personally. Worbla or anything like that would also work.
Also take into account the temperature.
Yeah. Yes. So his under jacket there would be perfect for that quilted cotton. You could also get a cotton and quilt it yourself if you're feeling a little bit adventurous and crazy.
It's not as hard as you think. Okay.
It's just time consuming.
Those were the fabric companies I worked for. I was a quilter before all this. So.
Yeah. All right. So Samus is a kind of easy question. What would you use for this? Yes. Good job. Zagorus. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I would use linen and cotton. Yes. Yes, definitely. Because those leggings are so tight to his skin, you definitely want something with some stretch. And it looks like it has some sheen to it, too. So like a vinyl, I think, would be great for that, personally. All right, we got 2 more. Lady Dimitrescu.
And she's actually working on this right now.
I am working on this. I'm doing a knit jersey because I don't want to do a zipper, if I'm being entirely honest with you. Because the knits have those stretches, you don't have to do zippers. Basically, the pattern that I found, it would be really hard to put a zipper into it, so I'm doing a knit. But depending on how you like the sheen of this, I think a knit would be a great choice, a chiffon would be a great choice. Even a satin I've seen be beautiful for Lady Dimitrescu. All right, last one. We got Elrond from Rings of Power version. This is a trick question because we didn't cover this fabric yet. Does anybody know what this is? Yes, I heard it back there. It's a brocade or jacquard. It's kind of the same thing. I wish I could remember the difference. I know one is the same on both sides and the other one is the opposite, but I don't remember which is which.
It's the way the weave, one is woven and one is kind of embroidered on top. We did... What's Jason's?
Yeah, we did an Espion cosplay that used a purple brocade. It's very cool. It's such a good fabric for like adding in some texture and some more interest.
It is one-way directional though, almost always. So
Yes.
Keep an eye on the pattern.
Yes. Thank you.
Sorry, so sorry about that. I don't use it as often. So I came from the quilt world.
All right. So, speaking about patterns, where do you find patterns? For armor, I recommend kind of going with more cosplayers, honestly. Community Cosplay is amazing. She's wonderful. Punish Props also has a ton. They have a lot of free ones, which is a great thing. SKS Props also has a lot. Pretzel Cosplay is where I got my Lady Dimitrescu pattern. And Kinkapatsu Cosplay also has a lot. All of these are on their websites. Most of them you can also find on Etsy. And Etsy has way more than just these people. I do like highlighting these because they have video tutorials for basically everything too. So it helps if you can't like figure something out, if you're not sure a step. Yeah. Yes. For sure. Yeah, papercraft patterns are great. We're also going to be talking about how you make your own armor patterns in a second. Yeah, we're bouncing around a little bit. So for fabric patterns, Joann's, again, is a great resource because you can go and you can look. Etsy has a ton. Lots of people have been uploading more like specific cosplay things. Sailor Moon, there's like 50,000 different versions on Etsy. It's very easy to find things. Mood is also a really good website also for buying fabric. They're a giant retailer up in New York City. They have a lot of patterns and a lot of free patterns also. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more, I don't want to say generic, but that's the best word I have, more of a basic, not cosplay specific pattern, Mood is a good place to look. McCall's and Simplicity both have costume lines. They also have specifically cosplay lines. McCall's has their Yaya Han line. Her patterns are great for these things. We all know her. She specializes in this. If you're going for more of like historical costumes rather than cosplay, Folkwear is a really cool website. They do a lot of like historically accurate patterns. So if you're trying to go like Ren Fair costumes that are very like period accurate, that's a good place to look.
I don't really have anything to add to this one.
Fair enough. All right, so now we're going to talk about creating armor patterns. So this is the duct tape method. And the way this works is you want to wear an old t-shirt or just have somebody that you're very comfortable with. And you want to wrap yourself or the item that you're trying to make a pattern out of in plastic wrap. Then you're going to take tiny little strips of duct tape and try and capture the curves of the object or the person that you're working on. This is from Kamui Cosplay. We love her. She's the queen. Up there you can see how this works. You sort of just want to capture all of the curves so that you have an exact replica of the person, the object that you're trying to make a pattern out of. So once you have the duct tape all on, You want to take a look at the item that you're trying to make, the pattern that you're trying to make, and see where the lines are. So it could be seam lines. This is actually a great method for making corsets as well. They'll fit you perfectly. So take a look at the seam lines or just sort of the shape of the armor if you're not talking about fabric, and see where you need to hit it on your specific body or on your item. You also want to be mindful of curves here. In this image, you can sort of see where there's curves on her body. You have to add these little lines, which are essentially darts. They allow the material to stretch a little bit more. EVA foam does have some give, but it's very hard to just take a flat piece of EVA foam and make it into a sphere. So if you find sort of the apex of your curves and add this line, you can get two more or less flat pieces that you can actually work with. An important thing to note when you do this, make sure you have little registration lines, so like little lines like this, so that when you're piecing them together, you know exactly where they should go. We will talk about that in a second. So once you have all of those lines done, you want to cut yourself or the object out of this pattern. Make sure you number them. That's very useful so you know which piece is attached to which. And then you can take that and trace it onto your material, be it, sorry.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
I have been doing this method many, many times. Is it becomes so much pattern just
Yes, yes,
not try to draw it the second time because it will be.
yes.
We had that problem with the 3D printed mask, the Steve mask from Owl House.
Yes. If it's symmetrical, always just do one side and flip it. It's so much easier. But yeah, so you can trace this onto foam, warbler, fabric, whatever you want to use, and use it as a pattern. If you are using this method for fabric, make sure that you add seam allowance. I've made that mistake too many times. Seam allowance is essentially a little bit of extra fabric for making in your seams.
For apparel, it's
Yep.
3/8 of an inch. For like homeware, it's usually 3/8 to 1/2 inch. For like quilted patchwork, it's 1/4 inch.
Thank you.
The weird numbers I keep in my head.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about working with EVA foam.
Can I talk about one thing on the other?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So something we've done lately with this pattern process, we have one of our members working on it at the table right now. We found that if you find an item that is like a 3D printed item that you really like, but it's just too heavy or too bulky as a 3D printed item, you can make a pattern of that and turn it into a foam pattern. You can also size it up. You could actually print something small, make a pattern from that, scan it or something, and you can then size it up larger. So this process isn't just for armor or stuff on your body. You can use it to make sure that you cover boots correctly, or my niece just made ears and she wanted fur on it, so we were able to put tape on there and do the curves and actually figure out exactly the shape that the fabric had to be to fit on those ears. Her fiance right now is working on a skull that he needs parts for, and so he just covered the entire thing like this and was able to figure out parts to fit into the hole perfectly.
Yep.
So you can think outside the box with this in many, many different ways. So this is another one of those things where you should work with this, play with it,
Yep.
and just keep fiddling.
Yes. No, this method works well for all sorts
So much
of things.
stuff. I am just so impressed by what you can do with this.
You can even sometimes, if you go to this first step, you can make just like a copy of yourself and work off of that.
You can
your
make a
own
dress form this way too,
custom-made dress form.
because those are expensive.
Yes. And then it's exactly your measurements. It makes it so much easier for fitting. All right.
Now I'm good.
So now we're going to talk about working with EVA foam. So your first step when you're working with an EVA foam is creating or finding your pattern, like we just went over. Next step is to cut out your pieces. So with EVA foam, it dulls knives real fast. So I like using long box cutters, and I like sharpening it every like 3 or so cuts. You can tell when it's getting dull because it's going to drag a little bit more. It's not going to feel as smooth, and your edges are going to have like little jagged bits in them. When that happens, you know it's time to sharpen.
Try to get a titanium one. Olfa now makes titanium instead of stainless steel. They'll last longer.
Yes. You can also use an X-Acto. That's very useful for the 2mm foam, just because it is kind of hard to cut with the giant box cutter on something that thin. A lot of EVA foam is a dark gray or a black, so silver markers are a lifesaver. You can trace your patterns using those, and you can actually see it instead of a black Sharpie. So definitely recommend that.
Oh, and white gel pens. Those are like the best thing to keep in your cosplay kit.
So then you want to shape and texture. So you do this sort of 2 times. You do this before you piece it together, and you also do it after. So certain pieces, it just makes more sense to do them individually. Like if you have, I'm trying to think of a good example. If you have like a gauntlet that has 2 sort of different materials, like a hammered metal versus a smooth metal, it makes more sense to add the texture before you glue them together, because you're going to get the texture on the part that's smooth. So just look at your object and sort of decide whether you want to do this before or after. And honestly, most of the time we do it both.
And I actually want to add to that, because we are coming from a makerspace, EVA foam can go through a laser cutter. And you can put texture. A lot of those, if you ever see the textured EVA foam that you buy online, that is laser engraved.
Yep.
So look up your local makerspace.
Yep.
We want all of you.
Actually, if we look over at Bellows again, that gauntlet there, we cut out completely on the laser cutter. It makes it really easy for those tiny pieces. We all know Adam Savage, I'm assuming. This is his Nazgul gauntlet pattern, just without the fingers. But yeah, it works like a dream. It's also really cool because it can engrave. If you come over to the makerspace later, we have an Asgore cosplay that we engraved onto the foam, and so instead of like trying to carve out the little emblems and things, you can just and it does it for you.
Well, it's great for scales too, because you can just cut them and then layer them.
Yes, definitely. So with EVA foam, it is sort of heat shapeable, not quite as much as Warbler, but it does stretch. So you want to hit it with a heat gun. You can use a hairdryer, but a heat gun is going to be a lot faster. And then a rotary tool like a Dremel is the best way to get in different textures. It's also really useful for smoothing out your seams. It's very hard to get a perfectly flush seam, so you can just hit it with your Dremel or your rotary tool and sort of sand it down, and it makes it really smooth. So then you want to piece it together. So this is a good image for this. I really like using contact cement for EVA foam. Barge is the brand that I use. It's actually what they use to attach soles onto shoes. It stays very flexible, and it doesn't get affected by heat. If you use hot glue, you're not going to be able to hit it again with a heat gun because you're going to melt that glue. So using contact cement, again, Barge is a brand that I use, but there's tons more out there, is the best way to do that. With contact cement, the way it works is you put it on both sides of whatever you're trying to attach, let it dry, make sure that it's not shiny, and then you just touch them together and it will stick forever. Yeah. Yes, yes, it is very toxic.
Please do.
Yes.
I live in a small apartment, so I'm not.
Did you test out that stuff that was supposed to be less smelly?
I haven't yet.
So Barge has a new formula that is not supposed to be as toxic. So we have it, but we haven't tested it yet because it's like really new. But maybe look into that too. And again, look up a makerspace because that's what they're meant for, is for when you have an apartment and you don't have space to do stuff.
Yes. It's also something you could do outside. If you do it outside wearing a mask, you'll probably be okay.
Be the or what would the word? I don't want to say weirdo. Be the person in the park. Be the person in the park working on stuff.
Yep. I've been out on my balcony making cosplays late into the night so many times before I joined the makerspace. It's much better there.
I have a studio and a garage, and I still do weird stuff outside. So.
All right. So then you want to shape it again, perhaps. So if you do any sort of round curves, shaping it now makes it much more smooth. If you have some sort of ball or an object that's sort of the shape that you're trying to get, you can just press the foam onto it and it'll get that shape pretty well. It's definitely easier if you have seams there because it will be slightly pointed kind of no matter what you do, unfortunately.
And you can actually build a tool out of a ladle You kind of get like a stand meant for maybe like a paper towel holder and a ladle, just the part, and you can actually attach that to that, and you have something that you can move the EVA foam around while heating it, because the ladle, since it's metal, it will hold onto the heat and kind of help you form those nice curves. And it is super inexpensive, and it's one of those nice tools to keep around. I can't remember, I made something for my daughter using that. I think it was maybe the wings that are in there.
Yeah, we call that a foam anvil.
I did not know it had a name. It was just a ladle on a stick.
Fair enough. So then something that you want to do here as well is hit it with a heat gun to seal it. So you're essentially melting the top layer of the foam, and it'll make it so that your primer goes on a lot nicer. The foam isn't going to soak up as much of your material. It'll happen a lot faster. So speaking of primer, I forgot to talk about these. So wood burning tools. Yep. So in theory, you can. In practice, I have not had great success with it. Harbor Freight has some really inexpensive heat guns. Mine was, I think, $15.
Yeah, actually, I think heat guns at this current moment might be cheaper than a hairdryer.
Yeah, so.
And they have cordless ones. I just bought myself a cordless heat gun.
Oh, nice.
So that's what's nice about the Warbler, because it's a lower heat. The EVA foam needs a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because Warbler you can actually like stick on your face while it's still warm.
Ooh, yeah.
Ooh.
That's not the way to do that.
Oh.
Yeah. No heat guns on your skin, please. You will burn yourself.
So yeah, hair dryer if you don't want to burn yourself.
Yes. So a tool that I forgot to mention on the previous step is wood burning tools. So that's really useful if you're trying to get like deep grooves, like scratches in your material. It works like a dream. There's a ton of different tips that you can get like really different textures. Dremels also work great. I keep saying Dremel, rotary tools.
Leather working tools work very well on EVA foam, very similar to on leather. And so leather punches and things that you would think you would only use for like leather bags, you can do. I can't remember who it was, but I know that there was, I think it might have been Punish Props, who actually used leather working tools and leather patterns to prove that you can make the exact same thing out of EVA foam. So don't not look at leather tools also, and if you see them like on eBay or something, pick them up because they're going to be useful.
Yep. Leather stamps actually are another thing. If you get stamps and you heat them up, you can press them into your foam and get like little indents. It's pretty cool. All right, so then the last step before you paint your armor is you gotta prime it. So with primer, you want something that has some sort of stretch to it, especially if you're going to be putting on like a breastplate that goes around your body. You need to be able to get into that, and you don't want your paint to crack. So my favorite is Plasti-Dip. This is, again, an extremely toxic material. Please don't use it inside. It comes in a spray, which is what I tend to use. It does come in like a canned product as well. I haven't used that personally.
The wings that are at our booth were hand painted, or with the brush on.
Okay, cool. But there's a lot of other products out there now too. Plasti-Dip is actually an automotive primer. It's what you use like on the underside of cars. It's basically a rubber. Flex Bond is something that was made more or less exclusively for cosplay. It's a brush-on material that still has that same stretch of a Plasti-Dip. Latex milk is another option that I haven't used, but I've heard a lot of people enjoy. That is extremely stretchy. Please don't use this if you have a latex allergy. But it's incredibly stretchy. Your paint will not crack. Mod Podge is another option. It's not as like flexible as the other options, but if you're making a prop that is mostly stationary, like a gauntlet that you can slide on, you're fine to use Mod Podge.
And Mod Podge, I always say it wrong. I'm from that era. It comes in dishwasher safe now. It actually comes in flexible now. I saw that at Michael's the other day. It comes in outdoor, so like try all the different kinds, and they come in little bottles to test out, so you can do tests. So just in case you can't get your hands on the other stuff, there are options now with them. I think they realized they needed to make more options.
Yeah. I've actually used the glitter Mod Podge to like add texture to things. It's kind of neat. It's just play around with stuff. You never know what'll work.
Just keep practicing.
So now we're going to talk about working with thermoplastic. A lot of this is the same, but there are some differences. As always, you're going to want to start with your pattern, either one that you found or you made yourself. And then you're going to want to cut out the pieces. You don't need one of those giant box cutters like you do with EVA foam. Just a pair of sharp scissors works great with the Worbla. It's relatively thin like we were seeing, so it works well. Then you want to piece it together. As always, you're going to want a heat gun, a hairdryer will also work. The Worbla will stretch, and it also will stick to itself. So it's a little bit easier in that regard than EVA foam because you don't need as many materials.
The cool part is you can also put it in silicone molds. We accidentally found that out. I think my daughter, Coraline, took a piece and melted it up and like put it in a mold. So it's actually pretty cool for that too.
Yes. So speaking of the excess, something that's really neat with Worbla is that you can take all of your little scraps and melt them down and sculpt with them. So it's really great if you're trying to like add some sort of details to like a breastplate. Pretzel Cosplay does amazing sculptures with her Worbla, where she takes like all of her little scraps, melts them down, and she like sculpts things on them. It's incredible. So you definitely can do that. Make sure you wear something to keep your fingers safe because it will burn you.
Yeah, those gloves that are meant for like the curling irons that don't have the clip, those are great. And I just bought the cosplay group these little silicone fingertip protectors. They're really good for hot glue gun too, but it's good for that.
Yes. And then you are still going to want to prime your Worbla, or thermoplastic. So this image here, there's many different varieties, flavors, if you will, of thermoplastic. Worbla themselves make, I think, like 8 or something nowadays. Originally, it was this brown one that you see here, Worbla's Finest Art. That has a good bit of texture when you melt it down and stretch it. They came out with Worbla's Black Art a few years ago, and that has like the same amount of stretch. It's a little less stretchy, but good amount of stretch, but is less textured when you shape it. There are other brands outside of Worbla, like Thibra. Thibra is still very smooth when you shape it. Cosplay Flex has a little bit more texture than Worbla's Finest Art, I'd say. And Worbla has some specialty products too, like the transparent art where you can see right through it. It's very useful if you're trying to make like some sort of flame prop or anything like that. Pearly art is white. It also lets light through, so if you're trying to do some LED work, that's a great way of doing that. But the world of thermoplastics is massive nowadays. There's so many. I could talk about that for an hour. So if you find one that you're interested in, Google it. You will find images like this that sort of show you the texture so that you know kind of what you're getting into. And they all have different levels of stretch and strength and transparency. So if you are working with something like Worbla's Finest Art and you want it a little bit more smooth, some options for primers are wood glue or gesso or wood filler. It'll help you fill in those gaps. Something that I use a lot, I am blanking on the name of it.
Bondo?
Bondo, yes, thank you. I don't know why I go for a lot of automotive products in my cosplay, but I do. It's what you actually use to fill in little dents in cars. It sands down amazingly. Like, it's so easy to sand.
I'm thinking that sand and... So we also use a sand and fill primer for when we do 3D printed stuff, but I think that would probably work on this too.
Probably, yeah.
It's nice because it primes it, but you can also, you can sand it down really smooth with a fine grit sandpaper. So I bet that would work on this too.
Yep.
We need to test it.
Yeah. So to give you an idea, we actually have this guy right here. So this was 3D printed. If you're familiar with filament printers, they do have layers and you can kind of see the lines of where it was printed. We filled this in with that product and it's incredibly smooth. We can pass this around.
Yeah, this was actually, by the way, if you look closely, this was a seam. So I didn't have any support material. It was printed flat. So I printed 2 halves. A lot of the Bellows mask was too.
Yep. So primers and fillers are your best friend when you're working with these sorts of things.
All right, so switching back to fabric for a little bit. Oftentimes when you're doing a costume, especially if it's a newer show, movie, game, whatever, you're not necessarily going to find a perfect pattern for that character. So something that we have to do a lot as cosplayers is modify and Frankenstein patterns. So I want to talk a little bit about what is easy to change on a pattern and what's very difficult to change. Some things that are super easy to change on a fabric pattern are adding your sleeves, changing the length, either making it longer or shorter. I'm trying to think of more. Necklines are pretty easy to modify.
Yeah, because it's the bust darts are going to be the biggest pain out of all of them.
Yes.
It's called it's just a bust adjustment. Highly recommend looking up videos on this. Patterns for Pirates actually is a really good one on how to do that.
And things that are very difficult to change are your seams. So this middle image here is some examples.
Your butt too.
Yeah.
Anything with a nice curve.
This middle image is some examples of different ways to construct a bodice. So it's very, very difficult to go from, say, a princess seam, like you see here, to standard darts. It's just not going to work with your patterns. It's just different ways of making garments, and it's really difficult to go between them.
Yeah, because a princess seam is actually 3 separate pieces that you sew together. And say something with the darts, that's just one piece that you cut out with darts. So there is no way, unless you are putting just stitches to make it look like it, that it's going to fit right. Princess seams will actually be harder to adjust over, say, darts. Because darts, you can move them. A princess seam, you have to completely redo that shape.
Yes, definitely.
And that's where that pattern stuff we talked about comes in. Yes.
It took me forever to actually do it, but now that I have my standard measurements for everything, every kind of shirt I could possibly need, it was the single best decision I've ever made.
Yes.
I had one from before I had my daughter, and then I have one for after. I have not made myself clothes in a long time, but I used to make very intricate A-line dresses for myself. Whenever I'd have to go to a quilt convention, you had to wear the quilt fabric as a dress. It was like a thing that was required. So I have a whole closet of those, but I had to do the same thing. And it was amazing because I have a longer torso but shorter legs, which pattern companies don't account for. So it is really great to learn that. And again, I'm showing my age a little bit, but you guys have YouTube that can help with this stuff. So use those resources.
Yes, definitely. So many cosplayers out there have YouTube channels. They are the best tutorials you will ever find. So then something else that I want to talk about is Frankensteining patterns. So Frankensteining refers to taking 2 or more patterns and combining them. When you're thinking about Frankensteining patterns, the biggest thing to consider is if the seam lines are similar. So these 2 images on the left here, say you wanted the top of this with the skirt of this. That's pretty easy to do because the seam lines match up. You can more or less just, as long as it's from the same company and the measurements are the same, you can just smash them together and it'll work. Over here, if you go from, this jumpsuit and then you want to add this little capelet to it, the lines don't match up. And so it's going to be a little bit easier. You can do it, but it's not going to be as simple. It's definitely going to be some trial and error. When you're doing any sort of Frankensteining or modifying, please do a muslin, which is like a mock-up practice run of fabric. Get really cheap fabric from wherever. It can be Amazon, Joann's, and just try it out. See if it works, and then you can adjust it before you go to your super nice fabric, speaking from somebody who's ruined a lot of nice fabric.
Frankensteining also can include using fabrics that normally would not be used for that type of thing. Like I had mentioned earlier, you have to think about the temperature of when you're going to wear something. We have a member of our group who wanted a very classic jacket that would normally be made out of wool for Otakon, which is always, in the summer. So you were able to figure out how to make that out of the lightest weight cotton we could possibly do So that's
Interfacing
another,
is your
yeah.
friend. Interfacing is your friend if you're
Oh,
trying
yes,
to do
we used
that.
a lot of lightweight interfacing, and I actually used quilting cotton to make the jacket instead. But, so yeah, always make a muslin if you're changing anything that the pattern does not include.
Yes, definitely. So that was actually the end of our slides. Does anybody have any questions on anything that we talked about? Yeah. Yes.
I have one
That is
for
a
my
great point.
laser, because I live in an HOA where they would not let me have put an exhaust out for my laser cutter. I actually had to build, like, it's a piece of wood with a hole, so I could just put my window down over it, and I got a fan. Make sure if you're doing anything with fumes and you use a fan, there are fans specifically meant for fumes. So what it does is it puts the fumes away from the actual engine, because some fans, the fumes would actually go past the engine, which means they'll be combustible. So just keep that in mind for anything of that sort, because with my laser, I knew that I would be cutting some things that might have fumes, like acrylic, so I made sure that it was not going over it. And I also am building a paint booth in my garage that is going to have the same process. So, yes.
Drafting your own patterns tips.
So drafting your own patterns, having the blocks and the slopers and things like that, learning that process first is good, or having your own custom dress form. There are great websites now, not just YouTube, but there's websites like Skillshare or Domestika and things like that, where you can do hands-on classes with instructors online, where they will actually go step by step with you and talk to you afterwards type thing. Like, you watch a video and then they will talk to you afterwards type thing. Like, I think that's good. Also, a lot of community colleges have like just one semester, you don't even have to worry about credits, classes for this type of thing. Because yes, there's videos and all this, but it's also, that's really one of those things you need a hands-on somebody teaching you, because first off, you making something on your own body, like, that is hard. So yeah, look to see what you have locally. I took stuff when I did like a pre-college program in New York, and when this was like 20 some years ago, and I learned how to do it then. And my mom actually is a bridal dress seamstress, so I learned a bunch from her with that. So yeah.
Yeah. And coming from somebody who isn't a fabric expert, I am like a foam person generally. Using that duct tape method does work for fabric. Just remember you add that seam allowance, but that's a good way to sort of like see what shapes look like when you cut them out, and sort of like get an idea of what things are supposed to sort of work as. So that might be something to play with too.
Yes.
Yes.
I had to do that for my daughter, who has very specific tastes that are not easy to find in the States. So,
Jumping on both of those, something that I found is really, really helpful for going to Goodwill is they can put all their like shirt in the
Yes.
you want and just cutting it apart. Make sure that it's good, cut it apart, trace it, and put it back. And it's like the best tool too.
Yes, it's so much easier. That's
have
really
you tried
cool.
it yet?
I've tried it.
How much was the pattern? Because I'm thinking it's like, yes, that is where one of my princess seam dresses, I did that, and they fit so well.
What was the name of the website again?
Sewist? Yeah.
Sewist. Okay.
I used that 12 years ago, and I forgot what the website was, and I could never get back to it.
There's also one called Taylor Sweet that I've heard is not great. I've heard
Yeah.
Yeah, you're on your own.
You have to know what you're doing.
You need to know about pino lines, and you need to know like how to match pieces together, because if you like print it out and you put it together, you have to print it out, put it together, and then it's a print out. But you'll look at it and you'll be like, huh, well that's pretty. That's amazing.
Her, what is the one you're working on? I think the one you're working on right now doesn't have a pattern or instructions.
Yeah, my Lady Dimitrescu pattern doesn't have any directions.
It took us 2 hours to tape together because they didn't number the patterns either.
Yeah, so
We had 2 tables
it's
together.
been a process.
And it was like putting a puzzle. Like, oh, this looks like it fits here,
Yeah,
and it's huge too. So because so many gathers.
yeah. I'm not brave enough for that. Yeah,
Someday.
yeah.
We're all working up to it. Yes.
So I feel like it largely depends on what you're doing. So I have a bill from Beauty and the Beast that I have, and I use a hoop skirt for that just because you're never going to get that amount of volume with tulle. But in our Makersmiths room, I have a Pinkie Pie cosplay where I use tulle. It basically is just how much fluffiness and how far off of your body do you want it to be. If it's like a little bit, you just want a little bit of like fluff, poof, tulle is a good option. But if you want it like much further, more structured, especially like further down if you want it wider, I would go a hoop skirt, personally.
When my mother does wedding stuff, she also accounts for the weather. Because think about it, if it is hot, you don't want all of those layers. Having that hoop, you also have to account for, are you going to be showing off your shoes or something in photos? Do you want to be able to see that hoop, or do you want to see all the tulle instead? Like, I know when she was looking at wedding dresses, that was
Yes.
one of the things. So
Yep. In the back. Ooh, that's a good question. So,
I love tools. Rotary cutters and a cutting mat. Because you do not want to keep cutting with those scissors, because first off, your hands are going to kill you, but you are not going to get a straight line. Get a ruler, get a nice one, make sure that it's non-slip. Look up videos, by the way, on how to properly use a rotary cutter, because fun fact, most quilters that quilt on a regular basis are missing the tip of at least one of their fingers. They will cut through your finger. Yeah, I teach, you always put your fingers like this. I never put your hands flat, just keep that up, you know. I still have my fingertips. They also have gloves called klutz gloves where you can't cut through them, and they also have a grip on them, and they're double-sided, so it doesn't matter which hand. A very nice pair of scissors. Make sure you only cut fabric with them. Do not cut anything else that will dull them.
punch anyone who cuts paper
Yes.
with them.
And a lot of places like Joann's have yearly, they'll have scissor sharpening events. Take advantage of those.
Yeah.
Also, you don't need a serger right away. There's another machine called a cover stitch. If you look at the bottom of your t-shirt, that's how that was sewn. You don't need all the special stuff. Maybe later down the road. But definitely scissors, rotary cutter, a cutting mat. And I will real quick talk about this because Olfa, which is the brand that makes most of the cutters and stuff like that, donated a lot to our space. And one of them was 2 different types of cutting mats, turns out. One is meant for rotary cutters. If you use an X-Acto blade on that one, it will cut straight through it. Another one is used for X-Acto blades. So make sure when you're buying your cutting mats, you know what you're going to use it for. The one that you can use X-Acto blades on, you can also use rotary blades on. So if you plan on using both, make sure you keep an eye on what kind of cutting mat you have. Because they're not cheap, so if you cut right through it, you're done with it. Also keep them flat. Keep them hanging on the wall or keep them flat on a table. They do warp. Don't put heat on them. Another one is white dressmakers, pencils or sometimes
chalk.
Chalk. They have new ones that are like filled with white chalk and they have a little blade on them, and you just kind of roll them and they put a line and then they just rubs right off, and they can get right up against the ruler. This is another and her fiance got very upset at me about this one because I forgot to have him use the tool. Something to churn things inside out. They're called, yeah, there's a bunch of different kinds, but it is something you're gonna want, especially for anything skinny. I had him one day churn something inside out and completely forgot that I have like 8 different types of tools at home that would do that. A bodkin, which pulls elastic through. Once you buy that, they're like a couple dollars. You're gonna be like, why did I ever use a safety pin? A hem presser. It's a special piece of felt to be able to press seams and have them, or press like hems and have them perfect. Clover makes a really nice one for like $3. God, I could go on and on about this actually.
We're big tool people up here.
I worked for the tool companies too, so yes.
To add to that a little bit too, I know this is part of the sewing machine, but one of the best tools I learned from my sewing machine was the double needle.
Yes, because then it looks like an overstitch or a cover stitch, but it's not.
And it also works for stretch fabric.
Yep.
I learned about that this year and was cried because of all of the things I was like zigzag stitching and all the other things. Double needle was like my lifesavers.
Yeah.
And even if you're only making apparel, check out your local quilt shop. First off, they're dying and they need help. But second, just because you're not doing a quilt, you actually learn some amazing skills when you're there. Like I said, how to properly use a rotary cutter, the double needle, anything of that sort. Go and learn there. Support them, but you also are learning stuff that will help you so much down the road.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I got into foam probably about 3 years ago, so I can't speak longer than that necessarily, but all of the things that I've made have held up fantastically. Something that helps is if you seal your paints. So like using a clear lacquer on top of anything will keep the paint from chipping. It doesn't work great on pieces that are bending, but
Make sure it's a non-yellowing.
yeah.
They actually have ones that are UV resistant non-yellowing lacquers, so that will make it last longer also.
Yep.
The Plasti Dip actually makes a clear coat, and they make a clear coat that's chameleon. Fun fact. So it actually changes colors depending on how you look at it, since it's meant for a car. Again, the wings I have in the booth were painted with that. But they do have a clear version, and I believe it's UV resistant because it's meant for tools and things too.
Yeah. So I saw one more hand in the back, and then I think we might be out of time.
Yes.
Are they still back there? Maybe not.
I think they got bored of us and left.
All good.
So, first off, I guess, are interest the same thing, and then zero. Would that be considered like two-way stretch, four-way stretch, or zero stretch?
Zero stretch. So duck has a slight coating to it so that it can be used outside. Keep an eye on that, so you won't, if you wear it and you're sweating, it has nowhere to go. So kind of think of that. Canvas is a lot like denim, so it's a little more breathable. So and it'd be better suited. I would highly recommend not wearing duck cloth if possible, because you are gonna feel miserable afterwards. But if you're making a bag or say a belt, it's really great for that because it won't stretch, because it has no stretch at all. I think that would be it for today.
Yeah, we might have time for one more.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's smart. Yeah,
Not really.
yeah.
There are special, so for actually like sewing it. So this is one of those, it's not really an advanced tool, but it's a medium tool, and I again suggest this. So how a sewing machine works is you have the foot, and you have what's called feed dogs underneath. There's a thing called a walking foot, which you can attach to your sewing machine, which adds feed dogs on the top, and it pulls it through at the same speed. This is really good for vinyl, chiffons, tulle, anything that's slippery. And then there's things that are sticky. If there's anything sticky, they actually sell what's Teflon foots that can go on your machine. They used to be really expensive. They're like $8 now. You can get them on Amazon for any machine. And that's for like marine grade vinyls, faux vinyls, latex that has sticky. It won't stick to your foot, so it'll smoothly go through. Because if you try to sew that stuff without it, the stitches start to like bundle up, and instead of getting that nice top stitch, you'll get a bundled up stitch. Sometimes you can put like a washi tape or Scotch tape underneath, and that makes it glide also. I'm a hand talker. So yeah, walking foot it's meant mostly for quilters. That's how quilts are able to get the top, the middle, and the bottom layer to go through. But I used it for the gold.
That was very slippery
It
fabric.
was so slippery, and then in certain parts it started to get sticky too. And with that walking foot, I was able to just smoothly get it through, no shifting, because basically you have those little teeth holding on the top and the bottom. Just, if they ever get sharp, just make sure you can actually sand them down a little bit. Sometimes they get sharp because they get stuck on something, but they're not originally sharp. But they're really easy to put on because that little screw that holds your needle on, it actually has a little hook that goes around it. So when the needle goes up and down, it moves the foot. So that's how it knows what speed to go. It goes the exact speed that you're going. And I think if you have like a brother or a singer, they're about $25. If you have anything higher than that, they're about $80. But it's one of those tools you'll never have to buy again.
All right.
And
Thank you.
I will, yeah, we'll be, are you going to be over there?
Yes. Thank you all for coming. We are in the Makerspace all weekend, 10 to 6 every day. If you have more questions, feel free to come by. And thank you so much. You've been a great audience.